The main 616 Spider-Man comics are an absolute mess. We've known this for a very long time, but now I think it's time for a change. After decades of countless retcons, contradictions, and endless spin-offs, I think it's finally Marvel reboots the Spider-Man comics from scratch. Yes, you heard me, that's right. I believe this is actually a good idea. In this video, I'll explain why 616 Spider-Man has nearly become unreadable for new fans, and how a reboot might actually not be as bad as it first seems. And it could actually breathe fresh life into the character. The Spider-Man character, ever since his inception in the 1960s, has gone through so many editorial and writing teams that the amount of tones and writing directions that this character has been put through has been nearly unbearable. Not only is the personality of the character and characters in this book been wildly inconsistent up until now, we've also had countless retcons and rewrites that overwrite previous stories. The Clone Saga shifting the original story of Ben Reilly and Peter Parker on for way longer than it had to. Since past the story that tried to give Norman Osborn and Gwen Stacy kids. And quite possibly the most famous story that's retconned much of Spider-Man media is of course Spider-Man One More Day, which erased the famous marriage between Mary Jane Watson and Peter Parker. The result of all this retconning going on throughout the Spider-Man continuity in the 616 comics means that his story feels more like patchwork than an actual story. For example, every single volume, every single issue that you read of Spider-Man has its own self-contained story. But if you read on for so long, eventually you'll hit a roadblock. Eventually you'll hit a new writer, a new story, something that goes back on what the previous writer tried to set up and do with the character. Spider-Man One More Day, like I mentioned, was the most famous example of this, but this happens all the time. For example, the transition between the writer of Dan Slott and Nick Spencer felt a lot like a reset for the character. Nick Spencer's run on Spider-Man was even marketed as a new lease of life for the character. It was meant to be a back to basics for Peter Parker, but that meant that everything that Dan Slott was doing with Peter Parker was ultimately rewritten and sort of just shunned away and ignored. And yes, some of the fans really liked this because the Nick Spencer Peter Parker felt a lot more true to what people believed Spider-Man was meant to be. However, once again, it suffered from the idea of just ignoring everything that came before, feeling like patchwork rather than continuing a lifelong story of this character. Instead of feeling like a natural evolution, Peter Parker's life throughout the 616 comics, especially in the last 20 years, is consistently reset, and in many ways, it's awkward. It's gotten to the point that reading modern Spider-Man comics almost feels like a parody of what was the great, amazing Spider-Man comics back in the Lee and Ditko days. It feels like this is sort of an otherworldly version of Peter Parker. Ever since Spider-Man One More Day, it kind of feels like the comics aren't even canon. Like this is some alternate universe, alternate timeline. This is a branch from what we once knew and loved. Not to mention the sheer volume of stories and issues that we get with this character makes it nearly impossible for new readers to jump on. Now yes, every couple of years or so, especially in the last 20 years, Spider-Man goes through something called a volume reset. Now essentially a volume reset means that we get a brand new #1 issue for the character. And while we still do have legacy issues, this means that new readers can jump on and follow a brand new story. However, the problem with this is that even though it's meant to be a brand new story, the new #1 still has to deal with issues, problems, characters, and stories that were dealt with in the previous volume. The biggest example of this, I think personally, comes from the transition from Superior Spider-Man to the brand new #1 Amazing Spider-Man in 2012, where Dan Slott was set to continue the story of Peter Parker after he eventually came back from the dead. This was meant to be a brand new start for Peter Parker. This was meant to be a brand new jumping on point. This was meant to be something that the fans could latch onto and new readers could come and join alike. However, this story had to deal with the fallout of the Superior Spider-Man story, and to a lot of new readers, it probably alienated them in the first couple of issues. Not to mention, Spider-Man in the 616 universe has multiple ongoing series. We have the Amazing Amazing Spider-Man, we've recently had the Spectacular Spider-Man series, just to name a few. In the past, we've also had Web of Spider-Man, we've also had Spectacular Spider-Man, we've also had Just Spider-Man, we've had Peter Parker Spider-Man, we've had so many different runs and so many different series following this one character that it all just doesn't really seem to make sense. Not to mention countless spin-offs. I already mentioned Superior Spider-Man, but now of course there's Cindy Moon. We've also now got Spider-Gwen in the 616 universe. Miles Morales is in the 616 universe. So for new fans, where the hell do you start? It is just so overwhelming. Do you start on volume 1, 2? Do you start on one of the spin-offs? Do you not follow Peter Parker at all? Do you go and follow potentially Miles Morales? Who knows? And yeah, these are all good points, but people may think there's too much history to just reboot the whole character. But we've seen DC do this countless times, with Crisis on Infinite Earths, The New 52, and Rebirth. DC constantly reset their continuity to not alienate fans, to allow new fans to jump on, and to enjoy a brand new story without convoluted, patchy retcons that just sort of destroy any sort of continuity for that character. Batman has actually really benefited from this throughout the years, and because of this, new writers are able to come along and tell new, fresh, and exciting stories with the character because they're not held back by what came before. So if we were actually to reboot the 616 Spider-Man character and start from scratch, what would the benefits be? First and foremost, a reboot lets Marvel map out Peter's journey in a logical arc, like Spider-Man Life Story. You see, when Lee and Ditko first made the Spider-Man character, no one knew where this character would end up in 50 years. No one even knew about Mary Jane Watson. Gwen Stacy wasn't even a thing, and there's only a few characters from that era of the comics that people even know about nowadays. But since we've had the Spider-Verse, we've had the death of Gwen Stacy, we've had the marriage between Peter and MJ, we've had the Green Goblin stuff, we've had Electro, Sandman, Doc Ock, all these villains and all these cool stories, we've finally got a roadmap that a brand new series can actually take from and use to its advantage. Imagine a Spider-Man story where his evolution is consistent rather than being reset by editorial mandates and different writers. The next benefit, and in my opinion the biggest benefit to rebooting 616 Spider-Man, is to improve characters that really didn't get done justice for in the original Spider-Man comics. I think the biggest example of this is Gwen Stacy. Gwen Stacy is probably one of the biggest examples of fridging in comic books in history. If you don't know what fridging means, essentially it comes from the old Green Lantern books, where Hal Jordan actually found his girlfriend cut up in a fridge. Now, the reason for her death was only in purpose of the Hal Jordan character and nothing else, thus the term fridging. And of course, this happened to Gwen Stacy. Multiple attempts to make Gwen Stacy a more interesting character were actually put in place, but the writers constantly couldn't make her more interesting than, of course, Mary Jane Watson, and eventually they just killed her off to service Peter Parker's character. Now, while this is one of the most iconic moments in Spider-Man's comics history, ultimately, Gwen got fridged, and it probably wasn't right. So of course, if they did reboot the 616 comics, they could make her more than just the character that got fridged because Peter Parker needed an emotional beat in his life. So of course, if they did reboot the 616 Spider-Man comics, they could make Gwen Stacy a more interesting character than just the girl who died to service Peter Parker's character. Another main example is Harry Osborn. There'd be more room to explore his character past the constant Green Goblin cycle that this character found himself in the 80s and 90s. They could also add a lot more to Mary Jane in the earlier days. They could also modernize a bunch of the main villains like Doc Ock and Norman Osborn. And of course, another massive benefit if they were to reboot the 616 comics is accessibility to fans. Personally, I think if they rebooted the main 616 Spider-Man, I think we'd see the biggest boom in fan popularity with the character in the comics than we've seen in such a long time, because it's an opportunity for older fans to really enjoy a new story, but also for newer fans who have maybe been slightly deterred from reading Spider-Man comic books to finally jump on and join the bandwagon. And let's be honest, it isn't like new iterations of the Spider-Man character haven't been successful in the past. Most notably, Ultimate Spider-Man in the year 2000 by Brian Michael Bendis and Mark Bagley proved that fans will embrace a reboot when it's done well. It was a streamlined Peter Parker, there were modernized villains, it was modernized side characters that arguably did a better job than the original comics. And of course, this brand new comic gave way to Miles Morales, who is now a fan favorite new new character. Spider-Man Life Story by Chip Zdarsky is also another example that fans love a streamlined Peter Parker story from A to B. The new Ultimate Spider-Man series by Jonathan Hickman is another piece of evidence that fans love a streamlined and less complex Spider-Man story that really just tackles the fundamentals of the character. So then my question to you guys, if you still disagree with me, is why let the 616 Spider-Man be shackled to his past? Why not let him get rebooted? And why not let us get a brand new, modernized, fresh version of Spider-Man that can take everything that worked about the character in the last 60 years and implement it into a fresh, streamlined story where we don't have to worry about retcons, where we don't have to worry about patching and new writers and editorial mandates? Why can't we just take it back to basics and do something really cool while we're at it? Not to mention, we could get new characters like Miles Morales. We could get new stories, stuff that people have never even thought of before. But yes, I will admit that people will have the counter argument that yes, this does erase like 70 years of history, that we've come so far with these comic books, is it even really worth rebooting it? Because Batman does reboot and DC reboots their universe every 10, 15, 20 years or so, but they never get far enough along to the point where anything really matters, if that makes sense. Whereas Marvel has been going on for 70, 80, 90 years, and these characters have never been rebooted. Yeah, stuff has been retconned, and we've had things like One More Day, and we've had things like Infinity Gauntlet, and we've had different events like Secret Wars that do put a fresh spin on some of the characters and do kind of soft reboot in a way, but we've never had a clear-cut bang, this is a new universe, straight from the get-go, nothing else matters from the past. We've never had that happen in Marvel Comics before, so I think this would be really, really significant. Plus, if anyone wants to read the old 616 Spider-Man comics, they'd still exist, so it's not like that they would just be completely erased from everyone's minds. Either way, at the end of the day, even if you disagree, I think we can all agree that Spider-Man deserves better than a messy, inconsistent, mainline set of comics. A reboot could finally give this to Peter Parker and finally give us a set of comics in the main timeline of Marvel Comics worth reading. Do you agree? Do you think Spider-Man in the 616 universe should be rebooted completely, straight from a fresh start, or do you think it's a bad idea? Let me know in the comments down below. Make sure to subscribe for more Spider-Man content. We're trying to push for 30,000 subscribers. We're at 500 subscribers off. I know we can do it in the next couple of months. Thanks for watching. I'll catch you guys in the next one. Take care and peace.